So I warned you that as a physician, I'm a soft scientist, but I do read books. And Iain Murray wrote a great book called The Really Inconvenient Truths, which followed, well, I don't know whether he wrote it around the same time. I suppose it was kind of like a promotional item that I had kept in my files. I think this is from National Review Online. Yes, it is. And he wrote it in 2006 on his book. And he covered 25 reasons why Al Gore, well, Al Gore got a C and a D in the 2 science courses that he took at Yale. That's not exactly what I would call credentials to be called by the press one of the finest minds that ever was in the vice presidential office. The fact is, Al Gore is not a fine mind. He is a politician, and he certainly never was a scientist. But Iain Murray will be able to give you a little more information on that. He's a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and that organization is one of the co-sponsors of this meeting. Fred Smith is the director of that group and is a fine person who is also active in the area of trying to push back on leftist scaremongering. Iain?
Thank you, John. I'm the only one on this panel who has the PowerPoint today, so excuse me while I get that ready. Sorry about that. I'm also the transitional speaker today. You may gather that my accent is rather similar to that of Mr. Bucher's, but my residence is Washington, D.C., and has been for the past 12 years. So I'm the Mid-Atlantic presenter today. And just while the presentation is getting ready, in case there are any alarmist spies in the audience, like there were yesterday, I know that one of them asked the question to the panel I was in yesterday, how do you sleep at night? So I'll just give you the preemptive answer today, which is on top of a large pile of money surrounded by many beautiful ladies.
Very good.
I'm here to take the title of my presentation in the book is Tracing Alarmism's Methods Back to Its Roots. And I chose a rather more fancy title for the PowerPoint, which is The Paradigm of Alarmism. One of the things I discovered when writing The Really Inconvenient Truths was that time and time again, whatever the environmental issue was, the environmental movement used the same methodology for promoting their scare in the first place, getting done what they needed to get done, and then once they had got it done, making sure that they had absolutely no blowback whatsoever. So I defined this as a paradigm. They have several, whenever there is an environmental issue that the environmental movement is concerned with, they have several tactics that they use. They always use a form of legal maneuvering. They will use regulation whenever possible to advance their cause, because they know it is normally very, very hard to get it through by legislative democratic means. They will use the background methods of the courts and bureaucratic regulation to get their goals achieved whenever possible. They also, I'm sorry to say, rely on intimidation, as we in this room well know. They have a preferred method of pushing their ideas via means of mass protests and pretending this is democracy. We saw it last week in the anti-coal protest in Washington, D.C., when they had about 2,000 people braving the snow and marching on the Capitol Power Plant, yelling, "This is what democracy looks like." Well, you know, that's not what democracy looks like. For those who are classically educated, that's what ochlocracy looks like. That is the rule of the mob, not the rule of the demos, the people. They have a disdain for humanity. Time and time again, when you look at what the environmental movement is trying to do, it is trying not to find some sort of balance, which is what they often claim, between humanity and the environment. They want to put the environment up above humanity, and I'll be trying to explain that as well today. And when you put this all together, it produces the paradigm of alarmism. The archetypal environmental crusade was the anti-DDT movement. Art Robinson talked about this yesterday in his excellent speech at lunch, and he has written wonderfully on it, calling it the Nobel Prize for Death. It started in 1962 when Rachel Carson published her book Silent Spring. This was the 1962 equivalent of a Michael Moore movie. It took some basic agreed facts, exaggerated them beyond all levels of conscience, manipulated them to push a message, and then became a popular sensation. From 1962 to 1967, we saw activity against DDT at the local level. And the interesting thing about this is at this very moment, this very beginning of the environmental movement, we saw the disdain that the environmental movement actually has for the environment. Because although we know full well what the effects of DDT the effects of the DDT ban were on Africa, the very first effect that the DDT ban had was to decimate the American elm. This was a case of tree huggers against trees. What happened was that by pushing these local bans, they removed the single most effective counter-agent to the spread of Dutch elm disease that there was known. The chemicals that they proposed in its place when they got the local bans just weren't as effective. There's a story in my book about the tree warden of Yarmouth, Maine, a chap called Frank Knight in the 1960s, who's still alive. He's in his 90s, and he saw how he pushed to make sure that the DDT remained an option to save the elms in Yarmouth. One year he went on holiday ill-advisedly, and when he came back, a ban had been put in place. That year, they lost all their elms. 60% of American elms were destroyed as a result of these local bans on DDT. 1967, the lawyers who put together these local bans all came together and formed Environmental Defense Force, a body which is not a body of environmentalists, it's a body of lawyers pushing for legal changes whenever they can get it. To this day, the Environmental Defense Force has a ridiculous number of lawyers working on legal challenges all over the country and internationally these days. They then put pressure on the Environmental Protection Agency. They tried to create a zeitgeist that DDT was so evil, it was morally wrong, that whatever the scientists said at EPA didn't matter. This moral pressure worked. In 1972, William Ruckelshaus, Nixon's EPA administrator, received a report from the EPA scientists that said that DDT basically was a harmless substance. It might have contributed to some small thinning of eggshells in large predatory birds, but it certainly wasn't harmful to humans at all, which of course is completely the reverse of what Carson had said 10 years earlier in Silent Spring, where she claimed that just touching DDT could give you leukemia. Ruckelshaus ignored his scientists' advice because the movement, the anti-DDT movement, had so successfully donned the mantle of science that it was seen as the guardian of science and not the actual scientists. So once they had got their national ban, they'd started with the local ban, then they got their national ban, they then started pushing for their international ban. And they basically got it in the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, the POPs Treaty, which is a very interesting treaty because this shows how they use international negotiations. They've got this treaty passed, and if this treaty can be amended by bureaucrats. The persistent organic pollutants, as they call it, that are banned as a result of POPs, are named in a schedule. They aren't named in the treaty itself. So all you need to do to change, to get a new substance banned is lobby some bureaucrats, they'll put it on the schedule. If this was ratified by the US Senate, then goodness knows what sort of mischief could be done, because as we know, once a treaty is ratified, it has the force of the Constitution in the United States. But it's also interesting that since it has become known that DDT has created such a terrible toll in Africa, they've started claiming, oh no, we're not lobbying for any ban. There is no de jure ban on DDT, and we're not lobbying for it, despite the fact that Greenpeace lobbied very heavily for the Stockholm Convention, along with others. All they say, the issue is that we don't want DDT to be used in widespread fashion. Well, how do you define widespread? It is defined, certainly by the European Union, as if any agricultural product imported into the European Union has traces of DDT in it, then that defines it as agricultural use. So the country from which it was imported faces sanctions. Now, when you consider how it is used in Uganda at the moment, as a good example, DDT is sprayed internally in houses to act as a repellent against mosquitoes. If you are a Ugandan cotton farmer, say, you don't have a barn like everybody else does around the world. You have a house. You store your cotton in your house. It then comes into contact with the DDT, which has been put on your walls to save the lives of you and your children. You then export it. The European Union discovers, aha, DDT, you're using it agriculturally, and proposes sanctions on Uganda. So it is, if not a de jure ban, certainly a de facto ban. Then we can look at how the paradigm worked with the anti-nuclear movement in Germany. Atomkraft, keine Danke. These were badges that I saw in my high school in Britain, a sort of cultural invasion of Britain in the late 70s and early 80s. Such was the strength of the German anti-nuclear movement. It started off very early with mass protests. 1975, 30,000 protesters went to the town of Wales in the Federal Republic of Germany to stop the building of a nuclear power plant. 1977, 20,000 protesters at the salt mines in Gorbelen, where they were going to use it for nuclear waste storage. 1981, 100,000 protesters clashed with police at Brockdorf. The New York Times report says that they used gasoline bombs on the police. This was where the mass protest idea turned into violence and intimidation. The New York Times report also says that they used high-powered slingshots. I'm not quite sure what that means. By 1979, this mass protest movement had coalesced so much that it actually formed the world's first green political party, Die Grünen, which was founded by an incredible variety of radicals and leftists, like Petra Kelly, who had worked on George McGovern's campaign, Rudi Dutschke, who was a student of Antonio Gramsci, who John Dunn and I were talking about earlier, the novelist Heinrich Böll, and a certified lunatic called Joseph Beuys, an artist, a very famous artist in Germany, but I heard him speak once, and my God, the man was mad. These tactics came across the Atlantic, and in 1977, there were actually 1,414 people arrested in Seabrook, New Hampshire. That's an enormous number of people to be arrested at a protest. And it's very interesting that when you look at the history of nuclear power in the United States, most people think that it was 3 Mile Island and in 1979, or the China Syndrome, that stopped the development of nuclear power in the United States. No, it wasn't. The nuclear orders actually peaked in 1976. And the anti-nuclear movement had actually had a great deal of effect well before 3 Mile Island, such that there weren't actually any new nuclear plants being built back then in 1979. And there was also the effect of the movement towards conservation as a result of the oil embargo. But this was extremely successful, and it was echoed all over the world. In the 1980s, as I'm sure Christopher remembers, and the 90s, we had a mass protest movement in the UK against the building of new roads. And again, this was a violent, intimidatory organization that was involved there. There was one particular character called Swampy, who was adept at digging tunnels with his bare hands underneath places where they were trying to build roads. It was like something from the Middle Ages of undermining siege fortifications and so on. And as a result, people of this ilk are now known in Britain as generally as Swampy. So there was a marvelous incident when global warming protesters a couple of years ago tried to break into the oil exchange in London, not realizing that the traders in the oil exchange in London are working class boys from East London who don't take very, very kindly to people trying to interrupt their livelihood, and so beat these protesters up with the words "sod off, Swampy." And then there's what I'd like to call the voluntary human extinction movement, which is where the anti-humanity element of the alarmist movement comes into full force. This started with Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb. Paul Ehrlich, regarded as a genius by Al Gore and his lot, a man who has been wrong more often than anybody else, and yet still remains credible. A group called Zero Population Growth actually had formal ties for many, many years to the Sierra Club. And if you were a member of the Sierra Club, you also had to sign up to the Zero Population Growth Manifesto. This led to something called full-service environmentalism, which was essentially, how can I put it, the full-service environmentalism is basically a complete disdain for anything on the planet which has anything to do with humanity. This is where the idea of humanity as a virus or a cancer on the planet came from. Now, it's interesting that recently we have seen a slight retreat from this full-service environmentalism because they realized that their zero population growth idea doesn't actually fit with their allies on the left in the pro-immigration movement. And so now we've seen that the Sierra Club has actually distanced itself from zero population growth. It still wants a smaller population for the world, but it's very much in favor of immigration to the United States because that's environmental justice. But when you think about it, this is completely against what they believe in any other sense, because immigration to the United States increases the impact of technology on the planet. So all these factors came together, and many other examples, to produce the paradigm, which is very simple. If you're an environmentalist, you identify your cause and the laws you want enacted. Normally, you do this by means of syllogism. For instance, global warming is bad, CO2 causes global warming, therefore ban CO2. Very simple syllogism. You create an apocalyptic scenario. You say that if what you want enacted does not happen, then the world will end. Almost literally in many cases. You also, and this is very important, you have to claim there's a threat to children. You must always do that. Then you must don the mantle of science and decry those who disagree with you, not as just disagreeing with you, but as anti-scientific. You then use the power of mass intimidation to create a clamor that rules out rational debate. You use intimidation if absolutely necessary. And once your measures have been adopted, you must defend them ruthlessly. You can admit no wrongdoing, you can admit no unintended consequences. None of that must be allowed to happen. So we saw the paradigm in action with DDT, as I explained earlier. The syllogism there was birds are suffering, DDT causes birds to suffer, so ban DDT locally, nationally, and internationally. The apocalyptic scenario, excuse me, I'm breaking these teeth in for our dog. The apocalyptic scenario was Silent Spring. The idea that because there are no insects around, because they've all been killed by DDT, there are no birds, and so the spring is silent. Yeah, how apocalyptic can you get? Rachel Carson also claimed there was a serious threat of childhood leukemia as a result of DDT, despite there being absolutely no evidence of that. She filled Silent Spring with pseudoscience. There was a great lecturer, I forget his name, who used to wander around eating DDT in front of people and going through a list of 95 different occasions in Silent Spring where Rachel Carson had got the science completely wrong. And that was just in the first 100 pages of the book. They formed EDF, Natural Resources Defense Council, other organizations to push for the bans. And then they still hold up the DDT ban as exemplary, despite significant evidence of significant harm. My daughter is a Girl Scout. I recently took her to the National Air and Space Museum, where the EPA was having an exhibition as part of a Girl Scouts Day. And there, like a holy of holies, was a picture of Rachel Carson, the great hero, the saint of the environmental movement. Oops. And of course, we're seeing the paradigm in action in global warming. Earth is warming, fossil fuels cause Earth to warm, so ban fossil fuels. That's a syllogism. And there is a literal A to Y of apocalyptic scenarios. If you go to numberwatch.co.uk, the great John Brignall has put together a list of all of the apocalyptic claims for global warming. There is one for every letter of the alphabet, apart from Z. And I'm still hoping that somebody will decide that global warming is causing zebras to go extinct. Threat to the children is very easy in this one, because all the scenarios take place 50 to 80 years out. So it is automatically about your children. They don the mantle of science in an inconvenient truth. The world's greatest scientist is now Al Gore. The IPCC, the false notion of consensus. I don't need to go into those because they've been gone into so much during this conference. They've managed to get vast amounts of resources for this. A $300 million advertising budget for the Alliance for Climate Protection. $300 million. That dwarfs the budgets of all the free market groups in the US combined, including the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, all these groups which are supposedly so big and influential. And then, of course, they do exactly what they've done to us this week. Call you deniers, call you delayers, call you climate criminals. They will not let us go. The whole point of getting this motion in place is to make sure that there is a cultural movement against the people that they call skeptics. There is absolutely no way that they will allow us any breathing room if they can help it. That is what we're up against. It goes across the board in the environmental movement. I'd venture to say it's a big problem, and I'm sure that that's what Iain is going to speak about next. Thank you very much.